Pharisees are often depicted as the enemies of Christ in his life. I still probably relate to them a little bit more than I'd like to admit, at least not in their opposition to Jesus. But one of the notable features we find concerning the Pharisees in Scripture is their obsession with rules and regulations. It seems in reference to the teachings of God, they're always trying to determine what is the right thing to do. And that's something I can relate to. I know for me as a Christian, I'm sure for many of you as well, I always want to know what is the right thing to do in every situation. And it would be helpful if there was just an easy list of do's and don'ts to follow, and that would always be enough. Now, this is true for many of the Jews in the time of Jesus as well. In fact, many were so passionate about following the law of God that many of them actually missed the point altogether. And we as Christians can fall into the same trap if we are not careful today. And this is an idea I want us to explore when we look at this passage. So if you will turn with me to Matthew chapter 12, and we'll begin by reading verses 1 through 2. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples became hungry and began to pick the heads of grain and eat. But when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples do what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." Now, we see that on one occasion, Jesus' disciples became hungry as they were making their way through a grain field. And so what they began to do, assuming with Jesus' permission, is they began to pluck the heads of grain and eat them. And that in and of itself was not inappropriate, even if it was in someone else's field. As long as they weren't cutting the sheaves down and putting it into a bag or a basket, they were at least allowed to pluck the heads of grain. However, the controversial point is on what day they decide to do this, and this is something that the Pharisees observe. They do this specifically on the Sabbath, on the seventh day of the week. And as you can imagine, the Pharisees were pretty upset by this. Now, what is so important about the Sabbath? What we know from Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11, that the Israelites were commanded to treat the seventh day as holy, and they were supposed to cease from their labors. That's what Sabbath or Shabbat means. It means to cease. It means to stop. And why were they to do this? Well, likely two reasons. One, it was for humanity, or at least for the Israelites, to take a day where they could rest and recuperate. And it was for everyone in the nation, from the wealthiest to the poorest, from even the foreigners and the sojourners that were with them. They were supposed to take a break. But we also see, very likely, it was to recognize God's work in the universe. After all, it is emphasized throughout the law of Moses that he worked for 6 days in creating the universe, and then he ceased, and he rested. Now, in the law of Moses, as we see in Numbers 15, verses 32 through 36, this was taken very seriously. In fact, in that passage, we find an example of a man who explicitly profanes the Sabbath when he is gathering sticks, perhaps for some kind of fire, when he could have clearly done it the day before. And because he did something so flagrantly disobedient, he was put to death. He was stoned. So one can imagine why the Pharisees are a little upset by what's happening, and not to mention how many traditions the disciples of Jesus are breaking in the process. But why is Jesus allowing this? Isn't he a follower of the law? Well, of course he was. As Paul points out in Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law. And if you were born under the law, you were part of that covenant, and you had to keep that covenant. And we also know from Matthew chapter 5, verse 18, this is something that Jesus took seriously. He says, For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. Now, of course, this is before his death, and we know not everything had been accomplished, so of course, Jesus was going to keep the law. However, superficially, it seems that we have some pretty serious law breaking here. How can we understand this? And I'll admit, if I didn't know what Jesus was going to say next, I would be pretty confused along with the Pharisees. But let's consider how he responds to their accusations. Let's read verses 3 through 8. But he said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he became hungry, he and his companions? How he entered the house of God, and they ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those with him, but for the priest alone? Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and are innocent? But I say to you that something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, I desire compassion and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is the Lord of Sabbath." Let's consider his first point in verses 3 through 4. In verses 3 through 4, he's referencing an event that we can all read of, or you can read of in your own time, in 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1 through 7. And in that context, David and his men are on the run from Saul. Saul is trying to kill David, even though David has done nothing wrong, and they are without provisions. In fact, in the story up to that point, David did not even have a sword. And so he goes by the tabernacle, the house of God, and he talks to the priest Ahimelech, and he asks if they have any bread. Unfortunately, the only bread they had was holy bread, bread that was specifically consecrated for the priest. Well, Ahimelech decides that even though it's not technically appropriate for them to have it, if they are at least ritually pure, he will allow it. So David and his companions were allowed to have the bread by Ahimelech. Now, why would Jesus bring up this point? Why would he make this argument? Well, some would say that what Jesus is saying is, well, if David can break the rules and get away with it, I can too. But that doesn't really seem like Jesus' approach to the law. More likely what Jesus is saying is if the physical needs of David's men took priority over ritual, certainly the physical needs of Jesus and his men took priority over ritual as well. After all, as we're reading the book of Matthew, we should be able to clearly see even something that Jesus is many times greater than David. Now, his second argument is in verses 5 through 6 is that the priest technically break the Sabbath every single week. What is he talking about here? Well, we know from Numbers chapter 28, verses 9 through 10, that the priest had to offer sacrifices every Saturday, which by anyone's definition would be considered a form of work or labor. We also know from Leviticus chapter 24, verse 8, that they had to change out the showbread as well. But he argues that he is greater than the temple. And if the priest are allowed to break Sabbath regulation to serve God in such a great way, certainly his disciples should be able to as well. But how is Jesus greater than the temple? Well, what is a temple? A temple is typically, especially in the Old Testament, it is understood as a physical structure that houses the presence of God. But Jesus was a temple, and even more so, many times over. Consider what Paul says in Colossians chapter 2, verse 9. In reference to Jesus, he says, "For in him all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form." Also in reference to John chapter 2, verse 19, when Jesus is cleansing the temple, he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Now, thankfully, the Apostle John, in John chapter 2, verse 21, he makes a little comment to help us understand what Jesus is saying. He said that Jesus was talking about his body. As we can see from the life of Christ, the presence of God dwelt in his body in a fuller way than the temple ever possessed the presence of God. In fact, Jesus was God in the flesh himself. So his point is, if the priests are allowed to break Sabbath regulations to serve God, certainly his disciples who are serving something even greater. Now, his next point in verse 7 is not as much of an argument, but more of a statement. He says that the Pharisees were prioritizing sacrifice over compassion. Now, obviously, Jesus or the Pharisees are not really dealing with sacrifice here, but what Jesus is doing is he's referencing a principle that we find time and time again over throughout the Old Testament, where God prioritizes something like obedience or compassion or loyalty over the ritualized system. For example, in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 22, Samuel points out to Saul that God prioritizes and enjoys obedience over sacrifice. We also find in Hosea chapter 6, verse 6, the passage that he is referencing, that God enjoys compassion and loyalty even over sacrifice. And if this was true of sacrifice, certainly this would be true of Sabbath regulation as well. And because the Pharisees ignored this principle, they were too quick to condemn the disciples of Jesus, even though they were innocent. Now, his final point is in verse 8. He says, Jesus says that he is the Lord of Sabbath. Now, why would he bring that up? Well, some again would say that Jesus is saying, because I am the one in charge, I'm the master of the Sabbath, I can kind of do what I want on it. But again, that doesn't seem, that seems a little out of his character. Perhaps more accurately, what Jesus is saying is, because I'm the master of the Sabbath, I understand it. And I understand what is appropriate and what should be prioritized on this day more than anyone else. And based off his interpretations, I would have to agree. Now, before we explore how this passage can apply to us today, I want us to consider just one other passage that is very similar to this one. Let's go ahead and read verses 9 through 14 together. Matthew chapter 12, verses 9 through 14. Departing from there, he went into their synagogue, and a man was there whose hand was withered. And they questioned Jesus, asking, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" so that they might accuse him. And he said to them, "What man is there among you who has a sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will he not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable then is a man than a sheep? So then it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and it was restored to normal, like the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him as to how they might destroy him. Now, as you can imagine, as Jesus would continue to go against the traditional interpretations of the law, he would become infamous in many ways. And the Pharisees, just like many politicians today, when they realize their opponent has a controversial position or practice, they're going to try to put them in an awkward position to make them look bad or to discredit them. And they attempt to do that here in the synagogue. We see on one particular occasion, Jesus shows up to their synagogue, perhaps just to devote himself to God, or perhaps to take that as an opportunity to teach about the kingdom, maybe both. But for whatever reason, as he enters the synagogue, they ask him, "Is it appropriate to heal on the Sabbath?" Likely they're expecting him to say yes, and then they can, show everyone what a heretic he is by giving the wrong answer. But Jesus turns this against them. He says, "What man is there among you who has a sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, he will not take hold of it and lift it out?" Now, obviously, they understood an animal's life was worth breaking the Sabbath over. However, unfortunately, they would not apply that same logic and reason to a person who is sick or to a person in need. And in a simultaneous act of compassion and defiance, Jesus heals the man. And as we see from verse 14, it is at this point in Matthew's narrative that the Pharisees attempt or plan to conspire to destroy him. Now let's consider the Pharisees' approach to the law versus Jesus' approach. In the ancient world, it was believed that the gods ran the cosmos and that it was the king's job to create an orderly society. Now, of course, the Israelites understood that it was their God that ran everything. And not only was their God the one who ran the universe, but he was also their king. At least that's how it was initially supposed to be in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 7. And as a king, he gives Israel the law they need to run an orderly society. Now, if you've read the law of Moses, which technically encompasses the books from Genesis to Deuteronomy, you've probably read many of its laws, and you've thought to yourself, well, many of these laws are very precise, very accurate. There's no way to mess it up. God is very clear here. Although there are some other passages that are a little bit more difficult to understand. And if you ever feel that way, don't feel bad. Jewish people for thousands of years have felt that way. In fact, in the intertestamental period, we find that there were many debates on how different laws should be understood or applied or interpreted. Now, take for instance the Sabbath Law. We see in Exodus chapter 20, verses 9 through 10, that God says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male or your female servant or your cattle or your sojourner or your sojourner who stays with you. Now, initially you may say to yourself, okay, well, that makes a lot of sense. On the Sabbath, I'm not supposed to work and I'm supposed to rest. But maybe you decide just to be a little obsessive-compulsive about it. Maybe someone like a Pharisee, and you may ask, well, what is technically defined as work? What is technically defined as resting? Well, I certainly don't want to break the Sabbath, so let me think about this some more and try to come up with some extra rules so I make sure I don't do the wrong thing. Now, in the intertestamental period, there developed a fervor for the law that had not existed in previous generations, with the development of rabbis, with synagogues, a more consistent education of the law, and perhaps their renewed identity from the Babylonian exile. They pursued the law in a new way. And many became so obsessed that they came up with all these traditions to help them follow the law. In reference to the Sabbath alone, rabbis created 39 categories of prohibited activities that you could not do on the Sabbath, all in the name of making sure no one broke it or profaned it in any way. Now, on one level, you could at least admire their passion to at least try and get things right. But for many, like the Pharisees, and instead of allowing the goal of the Sabbath to teach us about God, to teach us what he wants for humanity, they instead made following the law and keeping the Sabbath the goal in and of itself, and unfortunately missing many of the great principles and the teachings behind it. Now, Jesus had a very different approach to things. Now, of course, as we see in Matthew chapter 5, verse 18, he was concerned with following the law. But Jesus was not just focused on the do's and don'ts of the law, but the heart and the principle behind it. Take the Sabbath, as Jesus points out in Mark chapter 2, verse 27, that the Sabbath was made for humanity. Technically for Israel. Let me repeat that. The Sabbath was made for Israel. But Israel, as people, they needed a day of rest. And it was meant to serve the Israelites and to help them in the way that they lived their life. However, if the Sabbath begins to work against man, let's say preventing him from eating when he needs to or preventing him from healing when he is sick, well then the Sabbath would no longer be serving man. Now, not only was Jesus focused on the law, he also understood that certain teachings and principles within it took priority over others. And this is something that Jesus was well aware of. For example, in reference to David and his men, he knew that their needs, the fact that they were starving, took precedent over temple regulation. We also know that in reference to the temple services, that maintaining God's temple and his sacred space was so important that the work of the priest was prioritized over Sabbath regulation. Of course, that would be true of his apostles as well. And in reference to someone in need, certainly they were more valuable than an animal. Certainly they were more valuable than Sabbath regulation. Now, we as Christians today are not under the law of Moses. As we see in Galatians chapter 3, verses 24 through 25. You know what? Let's just go ahead and turn there. Galatians chapter 3, verses 24 through 25. We'll start in verse 23. But before faith came, we were kept in custody under the law, being shut up to the faith which was later to be revealed. Therefore, the law has become our tutor or our guide to lead us to Christ, so that we may be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a tutor. As we see, he's referencing the law. So we as Christians are not under the same system that Jesus and his disciples were at that time. And under that law, there was about 613 commands the Jewish people had to follow. And you can imagine, with that many commands, there may be situations where it appears some principles or some teachings come into conflict. Now, thankfully, we as Christians today don't have as many commands to follow. But it never surprises me, the situations that life often throws at a Christian, where it seems they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. And the rock is a seemingly right thing to do, and the hard place is also a seemingly right thing to do. Or the rock is a seemingly wrong thing to do, and the hard place is also a seemingly wrong thing to do. And I know for many of you who have been Christians a long time, you've probably come across similar dilemmas in your own life. But we as Christians, whenever we are put in a similar situation, we should always try to give as much thought and focus to the teachings that he has given us so that we do not make the same mistakes that the Pharisees did. But there's one specific problem that I want us to take a brief moment to consider. It's a problem that the Pharisees had, and I think this is one we could just as easily fall into if we are not careful. The Pharisees became so concerned with following God's law that they forgot why they were following it to begin with. They allowed obeying the teachings of God to become the main goal but forgetting to also understand why they were given in the first place. And we as Christians today can fall into the same trap. Consider worship for a second. Now, we as members of the Church of Christ, we place a very special emphasis on worship, and we specifically try to worship the same way the apostles teach us to in the Bible, and following the same patterns and examples they have given for us. One of the ways in which we worship is we worship a cappella, without any form of a musical instrument. However, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if we forget why we're singing in the first place. Paul points out in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 19, that we are to not just sing, but to make melody in our heart to God. And if we're forgetting to do that in the first place, it doesn't really make a difference. We're also told in Colossians chapter 3, verse 16, that when we sing, we're supposed to be teaching each other and encouraging each other. And if we're forgetting to do that, it doesn't really make a difference. Also consider the contribution that we take every first day of the week. Now, of course, we're told to give, but if we forget to do it with a cheerful heart, it doesn't really make a difference. Also consider the Lord's Supper. We take that on the first day of the week, just like the apostles did. However, if we forget to take the time to remember Jesus, the reason why we're taking it, it is of no effect. And we can not only run into that trap when we worship, but when we live out our Christian lives. If prayer, if doing good deeds, if saying the right thing at the right time simply becomes rote, simply becomes a matter of practice without any thought, without any heart, just a list of rules we're trying to follow to get to heaven, then we're completely missing the point. And that was the problem with the Pharisees. They looked at the teachings of God and they said, well, if I follow all these, and if I forget the meaning behind all of it, well, then I'll be okay. And that is why Jesus in his teachings not only emphasizes right actions and doing the right things, but having a heart and a mind that is in sync with everything you do. That our hearts and our minds are also seeking to be pleasing to God and not just a set of correct actions. And maybe you're here today and you realize that maybe you're a little bit more like the Pharisees than you realized. Maybe you're focused on some principles within Christianity, but you've ignored even greater, even more important ones. Or maybe you're here today and you realize that, much like the Pharisees, your Christianity has become nothing more than a set of rules you're trying to follow. And you haven't given the thought or the dedication to the meaning and the purpose behind them. And if that's the case, we would like to pray for you. And we know that God will certainly forgive you, and he will give you the guidance and the strength to do better. But if you're here today, and you're not a Christian, and you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and you're willing to repent of your sins and put him on in baptism, we'd love to help you with that right now. If there's anything we can do for you spiritually, please come forward as we stand and sing.